Hello, it's just David here with my weekly video. Um, Next weekend, we're looking forward, of course, to a bank holiday weekend and to celebrations that will happen, particularly to mark the Platinum Jubilee of the Queen's reign. And I talked a bit about that last week, and certainly not going to underestimate its importance. But also, and perhaps it's appropriate, this happens on perhaps, well, one of the most important days, perhaps the third great festival of the Christian year, and that is Pentecost, the church's birthday, if you like, the time what we remember at the Feast of Pentecost when the Holy Spirit particularly came upon Jesus's disciples. I think perhaps, it's no bad thing these two things go together. As you may have picked up, whatever you think about sort of things politically, I'm a sort of believer that in the reign of Queen Elizabeth, we've seen the work of the Holy Spirit just in terms of her personally. She's obviously a person of very deep and committed faith. And there's something about the guidance of the Holy Spirit in her own life and indeed, therefore, in the life of this nation. So perhaps it's rather nice that these two things go together. And perhaps that sort of reminder that the Holy Spirit is primarily kind of in it for the long haul, that it is that sort of quiet undergirding of God's providence that we find upheld by the Holy Spirit. That's the most important part of the Holy Spirit's work. But I want to just think, therefore, for a few moments about the Holy Spirit. The week after Pentecost is Trinity Sunday, and there is sort of a feeling that, kind of having put those three bits together, we then sort of assemble the Trinity. And I think one of the things we get at this point is that therefore the Holy Spirit Pentecost almost comes as a bit of an afterthought. That almost, we've spent most of the time thinking about, God the Father and Jesus, and then we kind of get to Pentecost, we quickly kind of add the Spirit in just in time for Trinity Sunday. And certainly, if you look at the way the sort of the creed, the Nicene Creed, for instance, is divided, the Holy Spirit gets less words. But of course, Christian doctrine has quite rightly said that they are all equal in dignity, equal in being and substance. And so I just want to sort of think about how the Spirit might be equal and what might be the temptation of it not being seen as equal. And of course, I think some have kind of sort of tried to emphasize this by, and I mean, it's understandable, it's not wrong, but by kind of putting on the emphasis on the more sort of if you like, visible effects of the Holy Spirit. So people have talked about sort of, speaking in tongues or miracles or other kind of, quite sort of flamboyant works of the Spirit. And of course, those play a large part. But somehow I think, it can just sort of then concentrate on the kind of the spectacular, as it were, because I think, there is a sense in which the work of the Holy Spirit is unseen. I mean, the word, of course, in Hebrew and Greek is the word for breath or wind. It's almost something that you kind of don't notice. And, the wind blows where it will, says Jesus, or the Spirit blows where it wills. I mean, because it's in Greek, it's not quite clear what Jesus is saying at that point. The wind blows where it blows, and you can't kind of tell where it comes from. It kind of disappears in a second, but you've kind of known it's there, and you've known its effects. And sometimes these days people talk, instead of about Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they talk about Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Now, for those preaching on Trinity Sundays, you've got to be careful, because actually it's not right to say the Father is the Creator and Jesus is the Redeemer and the Holy Spirit is the Sustainer. That's actually wrong, because actually all three have a kind of participate in those things. If you take creation, for instance, right at the beginning of the creation story, we're told that the Spirit hovered over the waters or over the deep. So, you know, we know that the Spirit takes part in creation. It's not as though it's just something the Father does on his own. But nonetheless, in a sense, it's like they are the lead person for that. So the Holy Spirit leads in that gift of sustaining. And of course, sustaining something is, you know, incredibly important. We know that from sort of life, you know, but it's the thing that goes unnoticed, if you like. Um, it's the thing, if you like, that just kind of going along. So if you think about the, you know, the human body, I mean, you know, there's lots of fuss about sort of sustaining. There's lots of stuff about creating birth. You know, a new birth coming into the world is a dramatic event, and if that life needs to be saved at some point, you know, perhaps the person is ill or have an accident, and that's a bit like redeeming, I suppose, redemption, saving, roughly the same thing. Then that's kind of known and it's dramatic. But the rest of the time, of course, our body is doing a huge amount just to kind of sustain itself. We eat and drink and take exercise, etc., so that we can live. And that kind of goes less noticed in a sense. We're just kind of getting on with our lives. And I suppose on cosmic's term, you know, it's fairly kind of visible that the world is created. You know, obviously there's a feeling that the world has gone wrong and it needs to be redeemed, and that's quite kind of straightforward. And you know, the life of Jesus sort of speaks into that. But the idea that the kind of universe, that creation needs to be kind of sustained, that somehow it's going along, but it needs to be upheld by something, is kind of perhaps less obvious, and that's perhaps why, as I say, perhaps the Spirit gets ignored. And yet, that feeling of needing sustaining, of course, is totally important. It needs to, yeah, creation isn't self-sufficient. It's upheld by the sustaining love of God that kind of, if you like, keeps the balls in the air. And I'm reminded of those sort of, you know, words of Wittgenstein, which is that you can't see the edge of your visual field. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, he means that if you look at a picture, if I look at a picture of something or a photograph, I can see the picture in front of me, and I can also see the border round the edge. And actually, I can look at the border and look beyond it. It's not quite like that when you're looking through your eyes, because through your eyes you can kind of see what's there, but you kind of can't see the border around the outside, fairly obviously. But you know it's there. You know there's bits off to that side I can't see, though. I know they're there, and I can see bits ahead of me, but I can't see the limit of my field. It's not like the border of a picture where I can see, oh, right, you know, that's where the artist has, or the photographer has cut things off. And I think it's a bit like that for the Spirit, that you know, in a sense, you kind of can't see the whole kind of sustaining work that's going on, because it's kind of, it's like that border of the visual field. It's just out of sight. And also, I think, you know, particularly, and you might think about this with the sort of, you know, the Queen's Jubilee. I mean, I see something of, you know, God's grace in her life. But when you see that kind of non-spectacular, if you like, view of God's grace, that kind of sustaining, it kind of, as with lots of things in history, you can't kind of can do a control experiment. What do I mean by this? Well, I mean, so one of the things you would do if you were doing sort of a science experiment sometimes is you do a control. So the most obvious thing is a sort of drug trial. So you give, you know, 50% of people in a trial a pill that will produce some result. You give 50% placebo, which is a pill that looks the same but has nothing in it, and they're your control. That shows you what would normally happen to that group of people, and then the other 50%, that shows you how much better or worse or indifferent the drug makes it. And but of course, with history, you can't do that. So sometimes people say, you know, let's do a thing, say, where prayer works. Let's do 50% of people, you know, are prayed for and others aren't. But of course, you can't rerun history like that. We can't say, well, let's sort of do the last 70 years with the Queen, and let's do the you know the 70 years with somebody else who didn't have that sort of sense of faith and duty, and see how much the life of the nation has changed. I mean, it's an impossible experiment. It's impossible to say. History just goes on. There's no control. So very often people say, well, what good does prayer do in history? Is God in any way working providentially? And the thing is, perhaps we can only tell after a significant period of time. We can only tell, in a sense, looking backwards. We can't at the time saying, well, it's obvious that God, the Holy Spirit, is working now to sustain things and send them in a certain way. So, I believe and I perceive that in the reign of the Queen, somebody who is very upfront. I mean, sometimes I think surprisingly upfront in Christmas messages about having a deep Christian faith. I see the grace and work of the Holy Spirit, and I think that's a great sort of blessing for our nation. But as I say, it's not something I can prove in that sense of comparing it to this nation without that 70 years of sort of stability and faithfulness that the Queen has brought. In the end, it's a matter of judgment. It's something I perceive. But of course, it's hugely important if you think the work of the Holy Spirit as a sustainer of the universe is, that's how you understand its work. Now, of course, I mean, Christian theology says that, slightly silly expression, but if the Holy Spirit stopped working for 1 second, the whole universe would kind of fall apart. So it's incredibly important, and yet you kind of can't see it. As I say, perhaps in the way that you can, you look at the Big Bang and the creation of the universe, and you can say, oh, that's the work of God the Father, or you can life of Jesus and say, well, you can see God's grace at work in that work of redemption, particularly in the cross and resurrection. But yet, the Holy Spirit is more unseen. It is the wind that blows where it wills. But nonetheless, that is why, because of the extraordinary importance of that sustaining work, it might be less visible, less easy to see, but it nonetheless is just as much a part of God's grace and plan for this universe. And therefore, that's why when we come to the Holy Trinity on next Sunday, we speak of the three being alike in dignity, importance, and substance and being. Thank you.